All right. Good morning / afternoon. I got to wait 1 minute for some live people to join us. Wait 1 minute here, and I need to make sure that people can actually join. All right, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon. Whenever I do one of these live streams, usually you look at the same window. So some of the guys were making fun of me this morning because they didn't want to look at the same window. So now today, we are going to code from outside in my backyard. So welcome to the tour portion. There you go. There's one side of my house. And there's another side of my house. And you can't see it right now, but if you saw what I see, it's a disaster because we are actually getting the outside of our house repainted. So it's possible that while I'm recording this, some people will come and start painting behind me, but hopefully we'll get lucky and that won't happen. All right. So it's Docs Hack Day, or maybe you're watching this later. I did this a couple months ago about contributing to the core of Symfony. Today it's about the documentation, which is a lot easier a way to contribute to Symfony, in part because the team is very friendly. After all, if you update the documentation, you're not going to break anybody's application. So things are calm and chill and easy in the documentation world. So if you haven't contributed much before, this is the place to go. Also because when you're learning something for the first time, you have a fresh perspective. So me and the other guys on the documentation team, we've looked at Symfony for so many years at this point that if something isn't explained well for a beginner, it's not always obvious to us. But for you, reading through the documentation, you might read something, have some problem, maybe it takes you an hour to debug to figure out what's going on, and you realize that had this been explained a little bit better, it could have saved you an hour of time. That's the perfect time for you to open an issue or a pull request in the Symfony docs and say, hey, if this sentence had been here, it would have saved me a lot of time, and I want to help save other people time. So, it's a unique place in the documentation because for beginners, you guys are basically the best contributors. So we always want new people with fresh minds coming to things. So I'm going to look at a couple things, and if you see me look down, it's because I have my notes to my right here. I want to walk us through a couple things. You're not going to look at me or the outside of my house the whole time. I'm actually going to switch into presentation mode. I think that did it. Okay, let's go here. Guys in IRC, do you see my screen versus me anymore? I still see myself. Do you see my screen? Hopefully you do. I'm going to roll forward, but in case. As much as you guys, I'm sure, love looking at me, I want you guys to see my screen instead so we can actually go through some stuff. Cool. Wait, you don't see any screen. Hold on a second. No screen, no screen. Ba-ba. Haha, it's because I did it wrong. Aha, there we go. Now we have a screen. Excellent. Thanks, guys. All right, good. So let's start with the documentation page itself, which is up on github.com/symphony/symphony-docs. You know, obviously Google that, you'll find it. And there are, just like with the core code, there are actually several different ways to contribute. And probably the most important way that you can help us make the Symfony documentation great is not necessarily the way you think it is. We think of actually making changes or writing new documentation, which is cool, but the documentation team is just basically 4 people, and we get a lot of contributions, which is great. And that means there's a lot of stuff for us to look through. So first thing I want to start with is actually the pull requests. This is the most obvious way to contribute. We call it triaging. It's basically the practice of going into these pull requests and helping make sure that they are complete and worded well and clear. So me, as one of the documentation maintainers, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to come in here and see a lot of finished labels. When I see a finished label, it means that people in the community have already looked at that particular pull request and said, this is good, it's worded well, it's clear, and it's ready for merge. So me, I can actually just go into these pull requests, do a very quick review of them, merge them in, close the pull request, and life is good. So if you're looking for something to help with, and by the way, this is also a really good way to just learn how different parts of Symfony work. If you're looking for ways to contribute, in the pull request area, you're looking for anything that doesn't have the finished tag. In particular, things that either don't have a label yet or have this in progress label. The in progress label means that it's in the middle of us reviewing it, and it also may need further work by the author. So let's actually look at one inside of here. So here's one here. So added validator component documentation by Javier. So notice no label here. So if there's no label, it probably means that nobody has reviewed it or no core team member has reviewed it yet. So it's like perfect for you to jump in there and actually see what you can do. And in this case, this is actually a fairly big pull request. So sometimes pull requests will be very, very small. And what we're looking for in those cases is a little thumbs up that says, I agree with this, this is worded well, it's clear, or it's technically correct. Sometimes very small changes in the documentation can be complicated for us to merge because they might be very, very complex. So you might make a code change, but it's not clear to me as an author if that code change is correct. But you, as a reviewer, you might be more familiar with that part of Symfony. Let's say it's something in the form component. And if you look at a pull request, you say, yes, this code change is correct. If you just give a thumbs up in the conversation, in the comment section down here, that's going to let me know that it's safe for me to actually merge this in. But bigger ones like this, these are very, very easy to review, and it's very, very high value. What we're looking for is actually just you to read it, and not as a technical person. I'm not worried about all the formatting, like the little dashes here or the formatting here. We can find that stuff very well. What I want to know is this clear to you guys? Is it accurate technically? Did you find any problems with the code? And does it make sense? So, you can literally just comment under here and say, like, this is not right, or this is not clear, or sometimes this is way too wordy. Sometimes we can have sections that we just took 2 paragraphs to describe something. And if you have a better suggestion on how to phrase something or just explain something, then just put that in there. What we're looking for is specific suggestions. So basically, when you read something and you say it could have been worded better, you could literally say, change this line from what you have now to this, and it would be clearer to me. So very specific instructions that are very, very actionable. So again, we do this as the core contributors, but we are no more or less qualified, maybe in some cases less qualified than you guys as the community to make those kind of suggestions, because we probably already know the components front and back, but you guys might be less familiar. So if you can't understand the documentation, that's not good enough, and we want your suggestion on how to fix it better. So that's thing number 1, which is in the pull request section. And again, anything without that finished label on it is good. If you want to get really complicated, you can go into the needs comments one. These are typically things where we're having very heated, passionate difficult discussions about how to document something or whether or not we should document something. So those are good places where you can basically give your opinion and help us unlock those. Things with need comments are difficult because it means that there's some disagreement and we need to figure out a path forward so we can actually get that pull request merged in. All right, so that's pull requests. And yes, we are going to get to actually doing some contributing actually, but I have to go through this part first because again, this is the most important way to contribute. I mean, look at that. That's 313 issues and pull requests put together for 4 people on volunteer time to go through. So, you know, your help through this stuff is very, very much needed. So in the issue side of things, again, we also have labels. We don't use the labels quite as quite in the same way in the issue section. What you're basically looking for in the issue section is something that doesn't have this has PR. So that's our way of tracking that some, you know, if we look at this issue, there's actually a pull request already for it. So probably we don't need to actually look inside of it. Now there are 2 basic things that we're looking for inside of the issues. Sometimes issues are things that can just be done. And we try to use this actionable label if it's something that can actually be completed. So actually, let's click this actionable label. And you can see there are, wow, yeah, 89 open issues that we've deemed actionable. So this is a huge way to get into the documentation. Now, why are there so many actionable issues if these are so actionable? Well, notice we also have an easy pick next to it. So easy pick means we think this is probably going to be pretty easy. And you'll notice that there are not very many easy picks, at least not compared to actionable. So actionable means that it's something that has clear instructions. You could go inside of here. It's basically, let's see if we can find a good example here. This one actually has a pull request already. But document the controller : JSON helper. So that's a new feature in Symfony 3.1. It's a link to the pull request. So literally somebody just needs to get in here and do the work of documenting this feature. So it's actionable, but sometimes the actionable are actually quite large things. And that's why there are so many of them. So that's why we need your guys' help to create pull requests for these things. But like I said, you can go down here, find something that you don't know about, and document it, as crazy as that sounds. It's more fun if you're not an expert. We're going to check out your pull request and make sure that it looks accurate and clear. So don't ever worry in the documentation about maybe not wording things the best way, or maybe if you're worried about something being technically inaccurate, just let us know. We can check into it. Or if English is not your first language, that's totally fine because we can help you out with that stuff as well. So I really encourage people, boy, if we had an army of people that could go into these actionable things, that would be pretty awesome. So the other category, more or less, of issues are things that need discussion. So you kind of think of what is an issue that's not actionable? Why would there ever be an issue that's not actionable? It's because we're having some difficult conversation on something, and we need your input to help us get a concrete plan for what to do. So I think I have an example of this one as well. Let's see here. Here we go. Yes, this is a perfect one. So check this out. So should kernel.terminate be non-blocking with Apache/mod PHP? And you can read that description there if you'd like. But basically, the kernel.terminate event in Symfony is a way for you to do things after the response has been sent in a non-blocking way, in theory, meaning that your client already sees the content, but you're able to do other things. But your web server has to be set up correctly. It has to do with things like fast CGI. So basically, this user probably has a legitimate issue, and the fix for this, or the clarification for this, is probably quite small. I have no idea whether or not this is true. I don't use Apache. I don't know much about mod PHP. So this is just begging for somebody who does know more than we do to come in and figure this out. Because I mean, you can see Christian already commented on this, and it's like, what can we do until we get somebody to confirm it and say, yes, he's absolutely right, and here's the change that we should make. So these things are huge, and unfortunately for us, these clog up the issue queue because they're very, very difficult for us to close without your help. I mean, if no one on the documentation team has tons of experience with Apache and mod PHP, then there's nothing we can do short of, take a week and learn all about Apache and mod PHP, which I don't really want to do. So help us out with these things. And if it's a topic you're interested in, you can read more about Apache and mod PHP and this whole setup and learn about it, and then send us links down in the comments and say, yes, he's right, and here's some resources on why. So, basically trying to make our life a little bit easier. All right, so let's actually go in and do a little bit of contributing. So as I just mentioned, of course, the issues, right? There's lots and lots of issues in here that are actionable, and these are great things that you can contribute to. So wow, huge menu of things here. Probably the most common way is, and just as good, is just while you're reading the documentation. So realize that the documentation team is volunteers. We spend a lot of time merging pull requests. So just because when you read the documentation, just because something is explained a certain way doesn't mean it's explained the best way. In a lot of cases, documentation that you're reading was first written 6 years ago, which means that now things have changed. We've gotten better at explaining things. Maybe there's a part of the documentation that's actually not using a newer feature that would make this much easier. So we're only 4 eyes. You guys are thousands of eyes. So this is a very powerful way to contribute. So for example, let's say let's go to the cookbook. I'm gonna go down to forms. And how about, let's look at how to embed a collection of forms. So pretend I am reading through this and I'm trying to implement this for my project. And I find some things in here that aren't clear, or maybe something I would reword, or something that I just think we can make an improvement on. So obviously the easiest way to do that is, you can see this edit this page. I'll click that, but I'm not actually going to do it this way. So if you click edit on any page, boom, you are all of a sudden editing that document. If you make changes down here and commit, ultimately your button will be a little different than me. Actually, I can do it like this. Basically, when you edit this document at the bottom, it's going to allow you to create a pull request to the Symfony docs automatically. So I think we probably get 30%, maybe 50% of our contributions just by people clicking the edit button. So this is good. If you see something that looks weird to you, hit edit, fix it, send a pull request. Super easy. Those are almost always really easy for us to merge as well, because they're small. Small pull requests are good stuff. All right, but let's do the more complicated way. So I'm actually going to say here's what I'm going to change. So notice that in this entry, we are talking about a task class and a tag class. And I've actually made, originally when we wrote this, we made the tag have a public property called name. So let's say that bothers me, and we think it would be more clear if we made that private, because after all, in Symfony, when we have properties, we almost always make them private. So that could be a little bit more realistic if we made it private. If we have a beginner, they might see that this is public and wonder, oh, that must be important, why that's public. So when I'm using form collections, I need to make my properties public. So this is the guy we're going to fix here. And we're going to do it the hard way. In reality, I would just hit edit on this page and make that change, and life would be good. But let's go the hard way here, which is going to be, we are going to clone this, copy the clone URL, or use whatever your favorite fancy tool is for doing that. Of course, I already have the documentation cloned down, but let's do it anyways. All right. And that should go pretty fast. And of course, while we're waiting, just small thing to point out, but it's nice, it's easy. The URL structure actually follows the file name in the repository. So that seems obvious, but sometimes in programming, things aren't that simple. But they are that simple this time. So the file we're going to be looking at is inside cookbook, forms, and then form underscore collections, not .html, but .rst. So I mentioned already, when you guys are contributing, don't worry about if you feel like your English isn't good. No problem. We can help you rephrase things. The RST format, if you're not sure about the RST format, who cares? That's so easy to fix. We're happy to tell you if you made any mistakes with the RST format. We have documentation on RST. It's basically Markdown, so it's very, very simple. The biggest difference is probably that we have 2 little ticks around the technical terms instead of 1 tick inside of Markdown, but it's very, very simple. It's basically Markdown. It's got some extra features. Don't worry about it too much. The best thing to do is just to look at other documents, and you'll get a feeling of what kinds of things you want to do. But ultimately, don't worry about it. If you make a mistake, we will let you know. And actually, more than that, this is kind of a cool thing. Helps us out. When you do make a pull request, there's a section on here called Show All Checks. And the documentation is actually run against Travis CI. So if you do make some little syntax error inside of the RST format, that's fine because your pull request is going to fail. And it's actually going to tell us down here that you are missing a tick or missing something on some line of some file. So you have full power to code recklessly inside of the documentation because we have a test suite that will catch that stuff. So don't worry about it too much. The other thing I want to show you, and you'll see this with my pull request too, but just in case it doesn't happen in time, one of the other questions that we get is how I can see the formatted documentation, because of course you're just modifying these, there we go. You're just modifying these RST files, and obviously if you have a bigger change than this, you might want to see how that actually looks up on the site rendered. Now, once upon a time, we would actually have you install a bunch of software on your computer so that you could actually render the documentation and then pull it up in a browser. But thanks to our friends at platform.sh, you don't have to do that anymore. When you make a pull request, they automatically deploy that for us, and you get your own kind of mini Symfony.com right here, and you can go browse to whatever page you were looking at and see exactly what your pull request looks like. So again, code recklessly in the documentation, make a pull request, and let platform.sh and Travis CI do all the work for you. All right, so we want to change this public name thing. Cool, we're done. So let's go into Symfony Docs. I'll use my favorite editor for text, which is TextMate 2. And let's go through it this way. Cookbook, forms. You can see there's a lot of documentation. So that's why we need your guys' help looking at things. All right, form collection. Oops. Make that a little bigger. And we'll real quick make that change. So let's make this private name. Of course, then we're going to need and see why we chose originally not to make it public, because it adds a little bit of weight to the code. Because now we have to have these getters and setters. So everything in documentation is always a trade-off. So that's another thing where it's good to have people's opinions on issues. This would be clearly a subjective change to the documentation, and we'd want to get people's feedback on whether or not they think this is helpful. Oh, look, I can get rid of this tip now. And then the other thing, and if you didn't think about this, that's fine. We would have caught it on the pull request. But since I made that public, obviously we're going to be referencing the name property in a different way. So instead of arrow name, we're going to use set name and get name. So let's look for arrow name in this document. Set name. And we have one down here as well. Cool, and that's it. All right, perfect. So now using your command line or your favorite Git tool, use the one from GitHub, that's fine. Go ahead and prep that for commit. But look, I'm still actually on the master branch. So obviously we don't want to be on the master branch. We want to create a branch off the documentation or off the master branch to commit this. This is just standard stuff that is true to contributing to any project. So create a new branch. We're going to call it form collection tweaks. Now, one of the questions with the Symfony documentation and also the core documentation is what pull request do I branch off of? So if you look here, we actually have a branch for every single version of Symfony. And in theory, you're supposed to get that right. So what you're supposed to do is look at the change you're making and say, okay, what is the oldest maintained version of Symfony where this change existed? So if I make this just against the master branch, that would, in theory, only change it on the master branch of the documentation, meaning older versions of the documentation wouldn't get fixed. So if this same change should be made in the 2.3 branch, then it wouldn't get made there. So in theory, and I'm saying in theory because you don't have to go through this whole process, but I want you to understand it. In theory, what I should do is I should look at this here, and I should go and look at the documentation in all the previous versions of Symfony and see if it exists on all of the versions, or if perhaps we introduce this change on some more recent version like 2.8. The point is I'm trying to find the oldest version of Symfony that has this particular code inside of it. The easiest way to switch is we have the big switcher right here. The only tricky part is not all these versions are maintained anymore. So if I go to 2.2, it's going to actually tell me this is not maintained anymore. If I go to 2.3, it's going to tell me this is maintained. So 2.3 currently is actually the oldest maintained version. And if I look down here, you can see it has the public name. So in theory, I should make this pull request against the 2.3 branch. I'm going to do that, but you don't have to do that, because ultimately, if you make a pull request to the wrong branch, we're just going to fix it for you. So do your best, but it's not that big of a deal. So by doing that, that's actually going to create that new branch based on the 2.3 branch instead of it being based on the master branch. But it's all good anyways. Oh, and I should have done that before I actually made my changes. Shame on me. There we go. Looks good. Form the name property private to be more realistic. Cool. From here, I actually cloned from the Symfony documentation itself. We don't have push access to the Symfony documentation, so I'm actually going to need to fork that. So again, if you hit the edit button on Symfony documentation, a lot of this is just going to be done for you. So if contributing to this is difficult, or it seems like a lot on the Git side of things, then just hit this edit button, and GitHub's going to help us out with this. So I wanted to just kind of take us through the long version. So I just forked the Symfony documentation by clicking the fork button over on the Symfony doc. So I have my own fork here. I'm actually going to go and copy this URL here. I'm going to add that as a remote called Weaverion. That could be called anything. But what that's going to allow me to do is, normally you would push to origin, which origin in our case is actually where we cloned from. That's the official Symfony documentation. I'm now going to push up to Weaverion. Which I don't push to very much. So this is going to be a little bit slow here. Come on, upload. You know what? I might cheat here. So pushing to my, because my fork is actually an old fork, so I forked obviously from the Symfony docs years ago. So my fork is actually so far behind that when I'm pushing to it right now, it's uploading all of the changes that have happened to Symfony in a long time, because I don't normally actually push to my fork. So I'm actually going to push to origin right now, which is the Symfony one, which I have access to do. You guys don't have access to do. And I'm just doing that because it's just going to happen faster. There we go. So normally at this point, after you push, when you refresh, you're actually going to see something down here that says like, hey, you have a new branch. Do you want to make a pull request? And in fact, if I go to the... So this is what you would normally see when you go to your fork, and then you can hit compare and pull request. But if you want to, you can always just go find your branch. down here. So you would be doing this on your fork, not on the official Symfony docs. So your fork would have whatever branch you had, and then you could actually say new pull request off of that, and it would make a pull request to Symfony's core. Now, last thing that is important to know is, again, you want to choose the correct branch. So since I made this off of the 2.3 branch, I'm going to choose the 2.3 branch here. Again, if you mess that up, it's not a problem. We can merge it into something else. Oh, I should say that was not quite the last thing. One other last thing that is not required, but if you notice it, it's something we like to have, which is, actually, let me go through that again. So whenever you create a pull request, you'll see this guidelines for contributing, and I'll take you to this page here. We have a link to the pull request format. What it is, it's a little table here that we'd like to have you copy and put into your documentation. It just helps us kind of categorize your pull request so that we know, hey, is this documentation fix? Not really. Is it new docs? It's definitely not new documentation. Applies to all, that's the branch. So we're going to say kind of applies to 2.3 and everything, or you can say applies to all. And that doesn't fix any tickets, so I'm going to say NA. So it kind of helps us track that. And that looks good. So let's create the pull request. And that's it. So at this point, you're going to expect to see feedback from people, and you can make further changes to your pull request. But basically, that's it. So that was the hard way of going through things, because you can always just edit things right over here on GitHub directly. And in a couple of seconds here, you'll see the Travis CI hopefully pass. And you should also see a platform.sh link down here in a little while, so you can actually preview the documentation and see what it looks like. Oh, by the way, if you want to see your platform.sh preview earlier, like if you're making a lot of changes and you want to be able to kind of push while you're still working, then what you can do is you can create a pull request and just prefix it with this work in progress. And then we'll know that we don't need to review your pull request yet. You're still working on it, but that way you guys can get the whole platform.sh preview and kind of see how things look. Cool. Let me refresh this and see if, there we go. One of the Travis CIs is done at this point. Awesome. So that's it. I try to take the biggest, most complicated way through things, but at the end of the day, documentation is it's easy. You can't mess it up, except that all documentation is inherently subjective. Whether or not something is phrased more clearly in one way versus another way is very subjective. And you guys, the community, you guys are actually the ones that are most qualified to vote and say, yes, I like this pull request because this new phrasing actually is more clear to me, or no, I don't like this pull request. The old phrasing was more accurate. So thank you guys very much. If you have any questions, you can always find us on the issues on the pull request. We hang out in IRC a lot of times on the Symfony channel. Today, if you're watching this live on the Hack Day, we're inside of #Symfony-docs on Freenode. So join us, hang out, get some work done, and I'll see you guys on the internet out there. So thanks for joining me, guys. See you later. There we go. See you guys.